Hello everyone. In this episode, I just had two ideas to share about OSR games. The first is I was thinking of the fighter, the good old fighter in OSR games. And for this conversation, I'll grab two versions of the game, and it'll lead into my second idea. I'll go with BX and with Castles and Crusades. Because I had this idea that dawned on me. How do you make the fighter special, right? Because if push comes to shove, you can say the fighter is one of the best attack bonus. But even if they're a bit better than other classes, like very often what happens is like other classes can also do what a fighter does at a similar level. So how do you make the fighter really special? In games like Lamentations of the Flame Princess have addressed this by making the fighter the only class that advances in their attack bonus. But that's sort of a very drastic way of doing it, where every other class will suffer for the sake of the fighter, if you will, which is fine for Lamentations of Flame Princess, but for typical D&D like games where adventurers are still expected to somewhat become more competent, at least, it doesn't necessarily fit the default version of the game, if you will. It fits the version that is Lamentations of Flame Princess, but I wouldn't do that for default D&D. So let's have a look, because I do have an idea, and we'll look at BX. I have the Old School Essentials book with this BX after, but so we'll start with my idea, and we'll go back to BX after because it'll transition to my second topic I want to talk about. So in Castle and Crusades, what I noticed is what made me realize this was actually the Bard class in Castles and Crusades, which made me realize something about the fighter. So the Bard class in Castles and Crusades is actually a very, very good class to take because, as with other OSR games, characters don't level up all at the same time. So the fighter will normally go to level 2 at 2000 XP, and the rogue / thief normally goes to level 2 at around 1200, I think. Let me see in Castles and Crusades if that's correct. Yeah. 1250. Now, the Bard in Castles and Crusades doesn't have spellcasting per se. They just have some buffs, like they can charm people and they can buff their allies, and they're actually very good fighters as well. So that's how bards are handled in Castles and Crusades. So their hit dice are D10, just like the fighter. And their attack progression is only one lower than the fighter. Because in Castles and Crusades, every class starts without any bonus to hit, except the fighter starts at +1. But every other class, other fighting classes, even though they might start at 0, they go up by 1 every level. So the Bard has the best attack progression other than the fighter. So the fighter does get a +1, and then they also, well, we'll get to the fighter after. But this Bard for D10 and for really good attack progression and some cool special abilities levels up at 1500. That's nothing for a class with D10 hit dice and a good like almost the same progression as the fighter, and just as good a progression as the paladin and the barbarian in this game. Is only 1500 XP to level up. That's extremely good. Now, what I noticed though was interesting is normally the way that many versions of the game is if you see an attack progression that's a fighter or similar to, that means that that class will be able to use any weapon. it's kind of like we associate that, right? If the attack progression goes up by one every level, NBX is not that quick. I don't think. I'll double check, but if it goes up that quickly, normally that's a fighter class, and they use any weapon. But the bard uses broadsword, bows, club, dagger, dart, hand axe, hammers, javelin, longsword, rapier, scimitar, short sword, sling, spear, and staff. That's it. So that's a very good selection of weapons, but it's not every weapon. Whereas, oddly enough, like a class like the Assassin, who's not a direct fighter, and you imagine using very specific weapons, the Assassin uses any weapon. And they don't have that great of an attack progression. Their hit dice are d6. So it's kind of interesting, like, because I don't imagine the Assassin like using a two-handed axe, right? I mean, they could with this book, but that's not what fits the character. But nevertheless, so it's interesting that the bard, who's kind of like set up as this fighting class with some buffs, doesn't use every weapon, although has a very vast selection of weapons. And then the fighter, what they give the fighters like this a bonus to a chosen weapon, and they get a few extra attacks later on as they level up and such. So that's kind of how the fighter will be like the most the one with the best bonuses to hit, but not by any more. Can attack lower enemies many at once. But then when you look at the barbarian, has like d12 of hit points, and it doesn't feel like the fighter outshines the other fighting classes, like the paladin, like the ranger. Ranger has really good stuff in Castles and Crusades. So, and you look at the bard, and the bard has a really vast selection of weapons. And if you think of it in real life terms, someone who knows how to use all those weapons, that would be extremely impressive. Now, I don't think Castles and Crusades addresses it. I don't remember. A lot of old school games overlook that. Like, it's just like, this class is proficient with these weapons, and they don't tell you what happens if someone tries to use the weapon nevertheless. What if a magic user grabs a two-handed sword? And in third edition, it's -4 to the attack when you use a weapon you're not proficient with. But in Castles and Crusades, I don't remember seeing it. Maybe it's somewhere. And nevertheless, the actual bonus progression, that kind of fits, right? Like in real life, if someone's used to fighting with a weapon, even if they pick up a weapon they haven't really trained with, they still have some notions that are useful to them. So they can still get better, just not as good as the weapons they're proficient with. And it made me realize, like, even the barbarian is proficient with every weapon, but do you imagine a barbarian with a crossbow? Like, yeah, it could happen, but is that the default of what a primitive warrior would have? Because a crossbow is, by these standards, a pretty advanced weapon, right? So, again, this all leads me to think that something that could really set the fighter apart is if the fighter was the only class that can use every weapon. Now, I'm not going to house rule Castles and Crusades. I'm not going to go through the trouble of that and retroactively do that. It was just an interesting thought for if I had to make my own OSR game, I would make it so, because I don't necessarily want the fighter to be the only class that's good at fighting. Like they kind of did with Lamentations. That is really, really good at fighting. But this idea also that even in BX that was the case, I'm gonna get to it, but it's false. So this role protection is already flawed from the very beginning of the game. Even people who don't like, I don't like the extra classes because of role protection. Well, those roles have been, split already from the very beginning of the game almost. Maybe not all of them, like the cleric, the very beginning of the game was just a cleric, but if you look at the fighter, we'll get to it with old school essentials /BX. But I was thinking, in real life, someone who trained with swords a lot doesn't like. I don't think they'd be incompetent if you give them an axe, but they certainly wouldn't be as proficient. So, a barbarian who's used to bows, if you give them a crossbow, yeah, maybe they have some notions of aiming, but it wouldn't be as good, right? So I think that if I were to make my own OSR game, the way that you make the fighter stand out, the fighter wouldn't be the only class that knows how to fight, that's good at fighting, but they'd be the only class that any weapon they can use. Like, it doesn't matter what the weapon is, they can use. And if they were the only class that did that, it would be supremely impressive. It would be really impressive if that was the case. And interestingly enough, in Lamentations of Flame Princess, even though the fighter is the only one who advances in their attack bonus, every class can use any weapon. So that's just a quick mention. I guess I'm talking about 3 games at this point, not just 2, but okay. Anyway. Yeah, so like, it's sometimes there's the contrast. If so many class, even the assassin who doesn't need to use all weapons really for the role, like the assassin is not going to be using like a 2-handed axe, right? Well, maybe an executioner concept, but I mean, like, if they're hiding behind a curtain, like, you expect them to have blades or stuff like that, not like massive weapons, like a 2-handed hammer. Can you imagine the assassin's like waiting behind the curtain with a huge warhammer? So yeah, to me that would be an easy fix. To then the fighter becomes really interesting, because even if you have a class that's good at fighting, like the Bard in Castles and Crusades, like, there's going to be weapons they're going to grab and they're not going to be proficient with, and right away that makes a fighter special. Especially if you talk about finding magical weapons, especially if they're all at random and the GM is not always choosing swords for that. So that could be an idea. Now, and BX, first of all, the role protection is is kind of a joke, because in BX, yeah, you have the fighter, and then you have the halfling who's good at fighting, and you have the dwarf. So those are 3 fighter classes in BX. Now, what's interesting is the level limits, of course. The level limits that the halfling and the dwarf have to deal with. But, when you look at... Let me see something. When you look at the dwarf, for example... okay, so they have a level limit. So that's a balancing factor, which it isn't really, because when you think about it, I think that level limits are a really bad way of controlling game balance. And I might do a whole video about that, but the short version of it is, when you're at level 1, it doesn't matter. And when you're level 2, it doesn't matter. Like, as you level up, as you play the game, the dwarf is just better than the fighter in BX, and there's no balancing anywhere at all, except for the extra XP it costs to level up. I'll get to that too. And then the level limit hits, and then what happens is that character can no longer progress at all. So it goes from being like all or nothing. Either character is just playing better, or then they just plain suck compared to the fighter who can finally continue advancing. And will someone want to continue playing a character that has reached max level? I don't know. Kind of like what the White Hack does, where they allow characters after the max level to re-roll the hit dice and stuff like that, and gain stuff that has to do with the world. Anyway, beside the point. So another aspect is, you could say, well, wait a minute, Bruno, because the dwarf costs more XP to level up than the fighter. Okay. So level 12 fighter in BX needs 600,000 XP to level up, to get to level 12. And the max level dwarf is 12. To get to 12, the dwarf needs 660,000. What does that mean? It means that it's kind of a crappy balance, yet again, because it might take... Here's the thing. It might take the dwarf a bit longer to reach the same level as the fighter, but when they both reach a certain amount of XP, the dwarf is not left behind. You know what I mean? Is, okay, to reach level 10, the fighter needs 360,000 XP, and the dwarf needs 400,000 XP. Okay, so that means that you know, 420,000 XP, for example, they're both at level 10. So the fact that the dwarf had to wait a little bit, it's like the dwarf is not even a full level behind. You know what I mean? And no level limit, like I said, is a really bad way of balancing the game, because then it's just like you go from having a class that's way better than the other one to having a class that there's no point in continuing. It's all or nothing. Again, level limits suck, in my opinion. That's why I like Castles and Crusades doesn't have level limits. So then the fighter in BX is just objectively not that good a choice, unless you really wanna play beyond 12 level, for example. But by then the level limit is actually 14, unless you wanna go beyond. Which leads me to another subject matter I wanted to discuss, because in old school games, that's how the balance is done, right? If you ignore level limits, because games like Castles and Crusades don't have level limits, thankfully, but they do use the balancing factor of how much XP does it take to level up for this class, for this other class. It's not all the same. Which again makes the Bard a really interesting class, by the way, just as a quick side note again. Or even as a multi-class class. Well, I'm gonna say something interesting about what I noticed about like old school multi-classing that people discuss sometimes online. When it comes to these games, where what you do is you stack up both classes, and it costs even more XP to level up because it's like the worth of both classes, or however the OSR game of your choice handles multi-class, if it's an option at all. Sometimes what happens is you need to go into math if you really care. For example, if you multi-class because you want your character to have the abilities of two classes, then it's cool. Just do it and don't worry about it. But let's say it's kind of funny. Let's say you grab you have a class like rogue, and then you grab fighter as well to have better hit dice. Let's say it's your mentality. That's a good idea for level 1, if you want your character to survive more at level 1. It's a good idea if you have a concept where you want some fighter abilities along with rogue abilities and all that. But as the character levels up, you should look into it, because, for example, in Castles and Crusades, a rogue fighter, and I haven't done a calculation, I just wanted to share the concept and the idea. Rogues are d6 of hit dice, and fighters are d10s. So when you multi-class, you get an average of d8. So you would get, with a multi-class, you get d8. Now, what's kind of funny and interesting is, let's say someone says, "Oh, I'm gonna multi-class as fighter to have more hit dice." Again, very legit for level 1. In old school games, sometimes you really want to survive level 1, but then you're stuck at that level longer. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. I haven't done a calculation, but if it takes you much longer to level up, even if you have D8, now that you really have like more XP added together, the XP of two classes plus a little more, that's how it works in Castles and Crusades, now you can really say you're going to be at least a level behind compared to other people. You should actually look at your motivation for multi-classing, because it might actually be a wrong idea. Bad idea rather, because let's say that you are at 1d8 still, because it takes you longer to level up, but if you had been a pure rogue, you would have already leveled up, so it would be 2d6 instead of 1d8, and so forth. So this also in old school games, sometimes I find the idea of it's fine that it takes different XP for different levels. However, what I find kind of iffy is that very often old school games are still kind of, they use level as a balancing factor, like, oh, for characters of this level, this of interest for characters of this to this level. And I find that they should go by XP. I know it would be less intuitive, and at low levels it works, 1 to 3 levels, because you're kind of talking about how many hit dice do they have and so forth. But if you go beyond that, I find that the designation by level for old school games is not that useful. It should be designation by XP. Now, because all the old school games don't necessarily have the same XP charts and all that, it might get iffy again. But normally, most of them respect the whole idea of like a fighter levels up at 2000 XP the first time they level up. So, because then that's more of a real balancing factor if an adventure is for this amount of XP, right? So that was the whole other thing I wanted to talk about, how it should be designation by XP, not by level. If you wanted to be really technical about it, which I'm sure most people don't. And another thing is that, wait, what was the other thing I was gonna say? I lost my train of thought. So I was talking about the designated by XP, not by level, and well, I lost my train of thought. I hope it wasn't anything important I'll be going afterwards. I forgot to mention that. Must have been just a side. Yeah, must have been just something I had as a quick thought on the side. I'm really trying to remember now. Maybe I should just finish the video now. I'm just recording myself going like, what was it that I wanted to say? And I'm not gonna edit this. Like I'm doing this on the fly. Okay, doesn't matter. Tell you what, if I end up remembering, I'll put it in the description. I'll write it in the description. I'll put edit. This is what I forgot to mention. So you can look at the description if you want to know what it was. I lost track of. But yeah, that's it. That's my ideas on just like how the fighter could actually be really more relevant. And if you're someone designing an OSR game, I really recommend you do that. That the fighter, because even in BX, obviously, for example, even I think the thief in BX can use any weapon. Yeah, exactly. Although they have D4s of hit dice, so that takes care of it. But again, like the fighter role is reserved by the dwarf and the halfling as well. So there's that, and then just if you're designing an OSR game, I really recommend if you want to make the fighter cool, like have the fighter be the only one who can use all weapons. And then I just wanted to kind of like mention that how when you look at what the classes give you in old school games, if you're going to multi-class, or even for instance some extreme cases of classes that cost a low XP to level up versus those who don't, instead of looking at, oh, this is what you got at level 2, level 3, level 4, look, let's say for example, grab level like grab an amount of XP instead, and how long it would take you on average to get there, depending on the game you're running, and so yeah, okay, that's what I was going to get into. So even if you want to know what's my attack bonus, instead of going what's my attack bonus at level 5 with this class and this class, but in an old school game, looking at it from that angle is actually flawed. You should look at it, what's my attack bonus at this level much XP? How many hit dice do I have at this much XP? So for example, like if for this much XP you have D6 or D8. Oh, D6 is lower than D8, right? D8 is better. But let's say hit points are important to you. Look at this much amount of XP. How many hit dice do you have? Because if you have 3D6 compared to 2D8, because the other class takes longer to level up, you're actually better off statistically going to 3D6 rather than 2D8. But then again, you can look, because sometimes what happens is you, with old school games, like I showed with the dwarf and the fighter, there's it takes you a bit longer to get to the level, but you're not really a level behind. So sometimes it's worth just waiting a little bit more, but you still get better stuff if you're a bit patient, but you're not waiting a whole level. Like if you're not even a level behind, like between the fighter and the dwarf, like the dwarf is not even a level behind at any moment. Not for a full level, I mean. You're never. It's not going to be like the fighter's at 14 and the dwarf is at 12. It's the dwarf will be at 13 for a while, and then will also be at 14. No, well, not in this case because they stop at 12. So let's say level 10. Instead of the fighter will be at 10. The dwarf might be at 9 for a while, but the dwarf is going to reach, if they are gaining the same amount of XP all the time, which is not always the case, but if they are. Dwarf just has to be a bit patient. They're both going to be at level 10 at the same time. So, you have to keep that in mind. Okay, I remember what I was going to say, actually. It was actually, I also wanted to say, that's also why, in more modern versions of D&D where every class levels up at the same time, Some DMs prefer to have an unbalanced swirl where the players will encounter things that are way beyond them and things that are way beneath them. That's how I do it. But for people who run it like, oh, everything is balanced with the levels of characters, that is good for modern games. But for old school games, that's not a reason why I think it's important to really have different types of threats all over the place, because in a way, it's kind of like it has to be like that for everyone, right? Because yeah, it's a level doesn't mean a level, you know. A fifth level rogue is not a fifth level fighter. You know, just to get an idea. Let's see. Thief at fifth level, 9,600 for BX, and for the fighter, 16,000. So you see, this is interesting though, because now what I'm seeing actually is the same thing I was saying earlier. The thief is only because then level 6 is 32,000 for a fighter, but it's 20,000 for the thief. So there's a moment where they're both at the same level. They're going to intersect. They're going to be at the same level for a while. Now, of course, the 4 hit dice, that's a big difference. So it does mean something here. But it's kind of interesting to see how they're actually going to, like, there's a lot of cases where the classes are not that different. You know, they're going to spend some games, like, maybe one level lower, but it's, you have to take something like the elf that takes a lot of XP in BX to really feel like there's a big difference there, I think. Elf 5th level, 32,000, and we said the fighter was 16,000, and then 32,000 for 6th level. Yeah. So again, it's gonna be, they're not that far apart. Interesting. Anyway, okay. This one is gonna turn into just rambling and random flipping through the books. So I'm gonna stop it right here. Everyone, you can leave comments. Thanks for watching as always. And if you have suggestions of anything you want me to cover next, just let me know. Yeah, thanks for watching.